for global media, the
Yeah.
USAGM, and basically cut off the money for a bunch of these international broadcasters. Like we're talking big names here:
Yeah.
Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia Middle East broadcasting networks, and even like Voice of America.
And it's important to remember, right, that like they all get money from the U.S. government, but how they're actually set up, it's pretty different. Like Voice of America, the journalists there, they work directly for the government as federal employees, but the other ones like Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia Middle East broadcasting networks, they're set up as nonprofits and get funding through these federal grants so that difference in how they're structured. Like that's a big deal when we try to understand like what's happening right now because of this order.
Yeah, totally. That structural difference. It really explains why things have gone down so differently for each of these organizations. So I guess like let's just jump right into like what exactly is in this executive order and like what happened right away after it came out.
Well, I mean, what's really striking is just how fast and like how final everything seems like. I mean, in your sources, it says the order was signed Friday night. And then by Saturday, like all these Voice of America journalists were told to stop working right away, put on administrative leave. And then boom, Sunday comes around and some of them are being laid off. So it really seems like everything just stopped super suddenly for Voice of America.
It's like everything just froze. And then the other networks, it seems like it was just as direct, right? Because on Saturday, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia Middle East broadcasting networks, they all get these memos from Kari Lake, who's like this new senior advisor at USAGM. And these memos, they basically said their grants were done immediately, like right then and there, and that they had to give back any money they hadn't used yet.
Yeah, that's pretty intense, right? And, it shows how much things are changing and there could be some big consequences. And, just to give you an idea of how immediate this impact was, like the Voice of America website, it's totally frozen. It's showing old articles like it's like a time capsule or something. It shows you just how sudden this was. And it really might mean that this important source of information is just silenced.
Yeah, it's like a snapshot in time, almost frozen.
Mm-hmm.
But here's where things get kind of interesting, because even though these actions seem like the end of the story, several of these networks are like, no way we're not going down without a fight.
Totally. Their leadership at Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia Middle East broadcasting networks, they basically told their people, keep broadcasting, we're not stopping. And they're saying that these terminations aren't even legal, which means this is going to be a big battle.
And that battle, it moves super fast into the courts. By Tuesday afternoon, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty had already filed a lawsuit in U.S. District Court, going straight after Kari Lake, the acting CEO of USAGM, Victor Morales, and the whole agency itself. I mean, that's a pretty bold move.
Oh, yeah.
It is. And there's this quote from Stephen Kappas. He's the CEO of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and it really shows you where they stand. He said, "This is not the time to cede terrain to the propaganda and censorship of America's adversaries. We believe the law is on our side, and that the celebration of our demise by despots around the world is premature." I mean, it's a strong statement. It shows they're not backing down from their mission, and they really believe they're doing everything by the book. Yeah, it shows you just how serious this is and how much they're willing to fight for what they believe in. And their main argument, legally it seems to be, that you can't just cut off funding like this that's been approved by Congress. They're saying it violates federal law and even the U.S. Constitution, which says Congress is the one who controls federal spending. So this really brings up some fundamental questions about, like, who has the power to do what in the government?
Exactly. Like if we think about the big picture of how the U.S. government spends money, this lawsuit is asking a really important question about whether the president can just decide on his own to stop funding something that Congress specifically said should get money. It's like they're challenging the whole system for how these organizations are supposed to work and get their funding.
And it's not just the leadership who's reacting. Radio Free Asia's website, it says there's a lot of dismay from Asian dissidents and activists about this whole funding freeze. So that really shows you how this is affecting real people who depend on these broadcasts for information they can't get anywhere else.
Yeah, that's so important to remember. These networks aren't just like some abstract thing. They're a lifeline for people living in places where the media is totally controlled or censored. What those activists are saying. It shows how much they value the fact that these broadcasters give them news they can trust.
And talking about how this affects people, one of the scariest things that came up in the stuff you sent over is the danger this might pose to the journalists who work for these organizations. This isn't just about money and legal stuff. There are real people whose lives could be at risk.
Yeah, and what's especially worrying is what they said about the Russian-born journalists working for Radio Free Europe who are living in exile in Europe If they lose their jobs because of this funding cut, their visas could expire, and then what they could end up stateless or even sent back to countries where they could be persecuted just for doing their job. And that's a really disturbing thought.
It really is. I mean, these are people who often had to leave their home countries in the first place because they were committed to reporting the truth and giving people information their governments didn't want them to have. So to think that they might lose their safe haven now because of this is really unsettling.
And it's not just them either. The sources talk about the broader risk to journalists from all sorts of authoritarian countries who depend on these networks, not just for their jobs, but sometimes literally as a safe haven. So this whole uncertain situation is creating a lot of anxiety and fear for these people.
Yeah, you can only imagine what they must be going through right now. But in the middle of all this chaos, there's been some interesting international reaction, especially from Europe.
Definitely. Your sources say that European lawmakers and diplomats have been really supportive of Radio Free Europe since Saturday, and that suggests that they understand how important these broadcasters are in the global media landscape.
Yeah.
Especially in places where freedom and access to information are under threat.
And there's even been talk about Europe maybe stepping in and providing funding to fill the gap left by the U.S. cuts. If that actually happened, that would be huge, wouldn't it?
It would be really significant. Yeah. I mean, it would show that maybe the whole way these international broadcasting efforts are supported and funded needs to be rethought. And it also brings up some interesting questions about how independent these networks would stay in the long run if they started getting most of their money from somewhere other than the U.S.
Yeah, definitely opens up a whole new can of worms. But let's get back to basics for a second. Like, what's the core mission of these broadcasters, and why is their work so important? You sent me this really interesting quote from a Russian-American journalist named Alsu Kermasheva. She was talking on The Lead with Jake Tapper.
Right, Alsu Kermasheva. She really knows her stuff and understands the region. She talked about how essential Radio Free Europe is in providing objective information in places like Russia and Iran, where the government controls pretty much all the media.
Yeah. And what she said about the stakes involved, it's pretty powerful. She said that without these networks, there's going to be this empty space in the global media, and that Russia and Chinese propaganda will fill in. That's a scary thought, right? What happens if these broadcasters just disappear?
It is scary, and it gets right to the heart of why these networks matter so much to the people who depend on them. It's about giving people a different perspective from the official government line and making sure they have access to real information and different points of view so they can make up their own minds about things.
And that's really what it all comes down to, right? This
Yeah.
idea that it's absolutely crucial to get uncensored news to people who live in places where it's suppressed or just plain unavailable.
Exactly. And the fact that they're still trying to broadcast even after this executive order and losing their funding, it shows how committed they are to this mission and how much they believe in the power of a free flow of information across borders.
So, all right, let's wrap things up for you, our listeners. What are the key takeaways here from all this information about these international broadcasters?
Well, things are changing so fast, it's hard to keep up. But here's the gist. These U.S.-funded international broadcasters, they're in a really tough spot because of this presidential order that wants to cut their funding and dismantle the agency that oversees them. Voice of America, they had to stop operations right away, and there were layoffs, but other networks like Radio Free Europe and Radio Free Asia, they're fighting back, saying this is illegal, and they're still broadcasting. This whole situation has raised some serious concerns about the safety of journalists who work for these outlets, especially those living in exile. And there's been some international reaction with maybe even the possibility of other countries stepping in to provide funding. But what it all boils down to is these broadcasters, they play a huge role in giving people around the world access to news and information that's not censored. And if that flow of information is disrupted, it could have some really serious consequences.
Wow. That was a great summary of a very complicated situation, and it leaves us with something really important to think about. We live in a world that's more interconnected than ever. So what happens if people in places where information is already limited lose access to independent sources of news, regardless of what you think about whether these specific organizations should get U.S. funding? It's important to consider who wins and who loses when the flow of diverse and independent information is threatened. It's definitely something to keep an eye on and think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
You're welcome.
We'll see you next time.
See you later.
Bye.